Central Documentary Film Studios, Moscow. Chronicle of October, 1917. Script and direction, Igor Bessarabov. Camera, Valery Lovkov. Among the biggest cities in Europe, Leningrad is one of the youngest. It is not even 300 years old. The city on the Neva River is a city not only of majestic architecture, avenues, squares, and houses. It is a city of people who have gone down in history and people who live there today. It is a city of events that are a chronicle of the heroic struggle of the working class. Tsarist Russia in May 1913, by the pomp and ceremony on the 300th anniversary of the Romanov rule, the Tsar was counting on bolstering up the faith that the order in Russia was unshakable. But it was only the landowners and industrialists who lived in wealth and luxury. The toilers suffered from lack of rights, hunger, and slave-like labor. Their working day lasted from 12 to 14 hours. The peasantry were mercilessly exploited by the rural bourgeoisie. In the summer of 1914, Russia found itself involved in the First World War. Dead and wounded, throngs of refugees, destruction, and hunger. The war was in its 4th year. Then came 1917. Under the influence of Bolsheviks, more strikes began to flare up. In the capital, the general political strike grew into an armed uprising. Soldiers of the garrison joined the workers. Nikolai II became the last Russian Tsar. Petrograd was celebrating victory. The empire had collapsed, and together with it, its symbol, the double-headed eagle. The workers and soldiers took over the city and released political prisoners from the jails. The people filled Nevsky Avenue. The Bolshevik Party came out from the underground, and soon the newspaper Pravda once again came off the press. Soviets of workers, peasants, and soldiers' deputies were being organized throughout the country. The February Revolution found the leader of the Bolsheviks, Ulyanov Lenin, in emigration in Switzerland. After 10 years of exile, Lenin returns to Petrograd. At the Finland railway station, the workers, soldiers, and sailors heartily welcomed their leader. Lenin issued a passionate appeal to struggle for a socialist revolution, for power to the Soviets. After speeches and greetings, Lenin went to the home of his sister Anna on Shirokia Street. Lenin's mother had lived in this apartment, but she did not live to see her son return. The day after he returned to Petrograd, Lenin went to Volkovo Cemetery to his mother's grave. How much she had to live through, arrests, imprisonment, police spies, awaited all her children. For his attempt on the life of the emperor, Lenin's brother, Alexander, was hanged in Schlisserburg Fortress. For his political activity against the existing system, Vladimir Lenin spent a year in solitary confinement, 3 years in exile in Siberia, and 15 years in emigration. The ice on the Neva River will break many more times, and Lenin will already be 47 when, after long years of his wanderings abroad, he returns home on April 3rd, 1917. Lenin will address a meeting of Bolsheviks in the Taurid Palace. He will say that the revolution is not over, that it must be carried out to the end. No support to the provisional government. It is a government of capitalists. There is only one way to break out of this horrible war, to pass on all the state power into the hands of the Soviets. The peculiarity of the moment lies in the transition from the first stage of the revolution, which gave power to the bourgeoisie, to its second stage, which should place power into the hands of the proletariat and poor layers of the peasantry. Lenin considered that under the existing diarchy in Russia, the leaders of the Soviets, the leaders of the Menshevik and SR parties were supporting the bourgeois provisional government. Lenin will repeat his speech in the Petrograd Soviet in the presence of the Mensheviks, who met him with a hailstorm of catcalls and whistles. Bourgeois newspapers began badgering and hounding Lenin. He calls for an end to the war, all the more so that he arrived in Russia from Germany. That means he is a German spy. Return Lenin to Wilhelm. The streets and squares were filled with supporters of the war bearing placards, "Fight the war till victory." Now we know that everything happened just as Lenin had predicted. In the spring of 1917, he said, "In the majority of Soviets of workers' deputies, our party is in the minority, and so far in the weak minority. But the masses will begin to go over to the Bolsheviks, and it was not long to wait." On May the 1st, when for the first time the people were openly observing the day of international proletarian solidarity, the foreign minister of the provisional government, Milyukov, in a note to the Allied powers, reported intentions to carry out the world war till resolute victory is won. Spontaneous meetings flared up at factories and barrack houses. Under the slogan, "Down with the war," soldiers and workers openly came out against the policy of the provisional government. In those days, the Petrograd Soviet had the possibility of taking over the power by peaceful means, but the Mensheviks and the SRs were against that. A lively intersection in Leningrad. This is the former mansion of ballerina Ksheshinskaya, now the Museum of the October Revolution. And as of February 1917, it houses the central and city committees of the Bolshevik Party. Vladimir Lenin worked in this room. Here he wrote articles for the newspaper Pravda, of which he was editor-in-chief. From this balcony, on many occasions, he addressed workers, soldiers, and sailors. There is no photograph of Lenin in the spring of that year, but there is a drawing made by soldier artist Beringov, bearing the inscription 1917 Palace of Ksheshinskaya. Lenin said, in order to become the ruling power, the conscientious workers must win the majority over to their side. There is no other way to gain power. It was with this appeal that he addressed the April conference of the Bolsheviks. The final session was held here in the marble hall of the mansion. Among the participants of the April conference were Leninist Bolsheviks who had recently returned from prison, exile, and emigration. In order to win over the Soviets of workers and soldiers' deputies, the Bolsheviks regularly addressed meetings. This is the Kirov plant in Leningrad, the former Putilov works. It was here that Lenin addressed thousands of workers on May 12, 1917. He explained to the workers that only the Soviets were capable of terminating the imperialist slaughter to give the people peace, bread, jobs, and genuine freedom. The first All-Russia Congress of Soviets of Workers and Soldiers' Deputies met in June. In reply to the claim by Menshevik Tsereteli that in Russia there was no party that would agree to take power into its hands, Lenin proclaimed, "There is such a party. Our party does not refuse that. At any moment, it is ready to take the full power into its hands." The phantom of a horrible disaster, of economic ruin, was advancing towards Russia. Once again, the provisional government demonstrated its anti-popular essence. The war continues. More and more army units are formed. The army has been deceived. It goes into battle not for the sake of bringing about peace as soon as possible, but for the interest of the imperialists. The June offensive at the front, and once again, failure. More and more victims. Such is the result of the provisional government's policy to continue the war. Millions of workers held a demonstration in Petrograd on June 18th. Floating over this human sea were slogans, "Down with the war," "Down with the 10 capitalist ministers," "All power to the Soviets." The workers and soldiers called on the Soviets to take power into their hands. The Bolsheviks warned, it's still too early to act now. The Mensheviks and the SRs would not support the demands of the masses, and the provisional government was just waiting for an excuse to do away with the revolution. But it was already impossible to stop the spontaneous eruption of indignation. The provisional government, with the approval of the SR Menshevik Soviet, went over to the offensive and opened fire at the demonstrators. Films of the events of 1917 are an astounding document of that epoch, the shooting of the peaceful demonstration by the troops of the provisional government on July the 4th. The diarchy came to an end. The counter-revolution had virtually taken over power into its hands. The hopes for a peaceful development of the revolution were shattered completely. The 1st Machine Gun Regiment was disarmed in Palace Square. Thugs raided the Bolshevik headquarters in Ksheshinsky's mansion. The banners of the central and city committees of the party were burned. Everything that was there was destroyed. In the streets of Petrograd, counter-revolutionary groups were hunting for Lenin. The apartment in Shirokia Street was searched. Lenin was not there. Trucks carrying cadets hurried to the Pravda editorial offices on Moika Street. Luckily, Lenin had left the office just a few minutes before their arrival. The provisional government decided to do away with the Bolsheviks once for all. A decision to arrest Lenin and other Bolsheviks was made public. A case file on Lenin was already started in the prosecutor's office in the Petrograd Chamber of Justice. A house on 10th Rozhdestvinsky Street, the apartment of Bolshevik worker Alleluia. This was one of Lenin's hiding places. Without thinking about his own safety, he wrote newspaper articles exposing the vicious slander against the Bolshevik Party. The Central Committee decided to transfer Lenin to a safer place near Petrograd, to Yemelyanov, a worker of the Sestroretski plant. Having shaved off his mustache and beard and wearing an old coat, Lenin hurried off to the railway station to catch the last suburban train. Petrograd, Nevsky Avenue, July 1917. The editorial offices of Novaya Vremya and Vechernaya Vremya. 200,000 rubles in gold to whoever turns in Lenin. Lenin has fled abroad by submarine or airplane. All commissars are ordered to immediately arrest Ulyanov Lenin. Wigs will be sold only upon presenting identification papers. A worker of the Sestroretski plant, Konstantin Ivanov. While spies and hound dogs were busy searching for Lenin, in a shack of bulrushes on Lake Razliv, he began writing his book, The State and Revolution. Yemelyanov recalls, the modest shack became the real headquarters of the revolution. He was visited by Dzerzhinsky, Stalin, Sverdlov, Ordzhonikidze. From his very inconvenient shelter, Lenin supervised the 6th Congress of the party, being held in semi-legal conditions in Petrograd. The Congress adopted a decision to prepare for an armed uprising. The revolutionary proletariat and the poor peasantry were to take the power into their hands. Autumn was approaching. It was risky to remain in that shelter, for spies were prying all around. It was decided to move Lenin to Finland, to a more remote and safer place. Locomotive engineer Hugo Jalova took on Lenin as his stoker on his locomotive 293. Immediately, Lenin began loading the furnace with logs. Soon they had crossed the border into Finland. In Finland, Lenin was settled in the family of a Finnish peasant, Parvianainen, on the edge of a remote village, Jalkala. In those alarming days of counter-revolutionary rampage, Lenin was absolutely certain of the approaching victory of the proletarian revolution. He considered that the question about the attitude of the proletariat socialist revolution to the state was of paramount significance. And that is why he began working on his book, The State and Revolution, in which he explained to the masses what to do in the immediate future upon the victory of the socialist revolution. Jalkala was a shelter for Lenin for but a brief time. Soon, Lenin left Jalkala and traveled to the capital of Finland, Helsingfors. Here he lived on the 5th floor of a large house in Hagnes Square of the Social Democrat Gustav Rovio. The owner of the apartment was the city police chief. From the point of view of conspiracy and Lenin's safety, no asylum could be better. Every day, Rovio went to the railway station, bought up all the Petrograd newspapers, and through a trusted mailman, Kessi Akhmala, dispatched Lenin's articles to Petrograd. And he regularly brought to Helsingfors mail from the Central Committee for Lenin. Very few knew the whereabouts of Lenin, but the whole party read his articles in the papers Proletaria and Rabochi. It was with a feeling of pride that Lenin then wrote about the party of Bolsheviks. In it we believe. In it we see the wisdom, honor, and conscience of our epoch. In Helsingfors, Lenin was forced to change his apartments for the sake of conspiracy. He lived in the apartment of the Finnish machinist Artur Blomqvist. Here, Lenin learns that supporter of the monarchy, General Kornilov, had sent troops from the front to Petrograd so as to completely crush the Soviets. The danger looming over the revolution rocked the popular masses. The party of Bolsheviks called on the workers and soldiers to defend the revolution, to crush the Kornilov insurgency. The counter-revolutionary conspiracy was checked. The Kornilov soldiers were disarmed. The Petrograd and Moscow Soviets went over to the Bolsheviks. Lenin immediately moved to Vyborg to be closer to Petrograd. Here he lived at the apartment of the employee of the Vyborg Trude paper, Yuki Latuki. From here, he had reliable and smooth-running ties with the party Central Committee. September brought a great turning point in the Russian Revolution. Every article written here by Lenin radiated with confidence in the approaching victory of the proletarian revolution. History will not forgive us if we do not take over power now. Lenin was hurrying to get to Petrograd. On October 3rd, the Central Committee passes a decision to propose to Lenin to move to Petrograd to have constant and close ties. Lenin's last underground hiding place was in the apartment of Bolshevik Fofanova in Petrograd. The provisional government spies set out to track down Lenin with fresh energy. Every time Lenin left the apartment, he was risking his life. Petrograd, October 10th. On the second day after 3 months of being underground, Lenin for the first time participates in a session of the party Central Committee. His outward appearance was the same as he preserved for conspiracy. Late that night, by a majority vote, it was decided that, realizing that an armed uprising is inevitable and quite mature, the Central Committee proposes that all organizations be guided by this. A political bureau of the Central Committee, headed by Lenin, was set up to provide political leadership of the uprising. Preparations for the armed uprising were underway in all the districts of the city. The Petrograd Red Guards workers were armed and awaiting the signal to begin the uprising. Whole regiments of soldiers were going over to the Bolsheviks and Military Revolutionary Committee. A full-scale session of the Central Committee was held on October 16. Lenin declared, "We now have the upper hand over the opponent. It is precisely now that we have special chances to hold on to power." He was supported by Kalinin, Skripnik, Schmidt, Krylenko, and other members of the Central Committee. A military revolutionary center was elected for supervising the uprising. Bubnov, Dzerzhinsky, Sverdlov, Stalin, Uritsky. In an effort to forestall the action of the revolutionary forces, the provisional government issued an order to draw up the bridges over the Neva River, and an attack was being prepared against Smolny, the headquarters of the revolutionary uprising. A map of Petrograd was brought to Lenin at his apartment in the Vyborg side of the city, and he used this map for drawing up the plan of the armed uprising. In the evening of October 24th, he writes a letter to the Central Committee. The situation is critical to the utmost. It is clear as day that now, really, any delay in the uprising is tantamount to death. That same night, Lenin made his way to Smolny. He appealed not to waste time, to start the battle, while the provisional government had not yet pulled up its troops. And it was precisely by this that Lenin delivered the revolution from seemingly inevitable sacrifices. In Smolny, Lenin immediately came to the helm of the armed forces. Lenin looked unusual, without a wig, smoothly shaved. This drawing is a document, drawn with charcoal that historic evening by artist Shafran. 40,000 Red Guardsmen, 150,000 revolutionary soldiers, 80,000 Baltic sailors were ready for the revolutionary uprising. On orders of the Bolshevik Committee of the Baltic Fleet, torpedo boats and detachments of sailors will set out at dawn from Helsingfors. The detachments were headed by members of the Military Revolutionary Committee, Podvoisky, Antonov Ovseyenko, Nevsky, Chudnovsky, Mekhanoshin. The Proletarian Revolution was carried out during the night from October 24th to 25th. An American journalist, an eyewitness of the October events, Albert Rees Williams, recalls, "The revolution would not have been able to take place with such seeming ordinariness had it not been preceded by colossal preparatory work. That was an extremely unique, bloodless victory of the Proletarian Revolution." By the morning, the whole city, except for the Winter Palace, was in the hands of the armed proletariat and revolutionary soldiers. Red Guards took over the main post office and central telegraph. Soldiers of the Izmailovsky Regiment took over the Baltic Railway Station, and the Engineers Regiment the Nikolaevsky Station. Soldiers of the Kexholm Regiment took over the last communication center, the telephone station. The women switchboard operators fled, and soldiers sat down to operate the switchboards. The revolutionary cruiser, Aurora, docked at the Nikolaevsky Bridge, and its sailors immediately lowered the bridge. From Helsingfors, trainloads of soldiers were rushing to the aid of the Petrograd proletariat. At dawn, the Palace Bridge was lowered, opening up the way to the residence of the provisional government. A telegram from the Winter Palace to the Commander-in-Chief of the Northern Front. The situation in Petrograd is menacing. Establishments, railway stations are being seized one after another. The provisional government is in danger of losing power completely. But Kerensky was no longer in the Winter Palace. In the morning of October 25th, the head of the provisional government fled from the city in revolt in the car of the American ambassador. And during that early hour, Lenin writes his appeal to the citizens of Russia. The provisional government has been deposed. The state power is in the hands of the Soviets. The revolution triumphed. But the ministers of the provisional government are still in the Winter Palace, and the cadets are building barricades. Soldiers of the Peter and Paul Fortress have aimed their cannons at the palace. Meanwhile, the ministers are still in session in the Malachite Hall, and having received an ultimatum from Smolny, they reject it. Windows of that hall look out at the Peter and Paul Fortress, and that is dangerous. They move to the White Dining Room and sent a telegram to headquarters. The Petrograd Soviet has demanded the transfer of power into their hands under the threat of bombarding the Winter Palace by the guns of the Peter and Paul Fortress and the cruiser Aurora. Hasten the dispatch of troops here. The storming of the Winter Palace was delayed. Lenin wanted to waste no time, for the immediate seizure of the palace would make it possible to avoid casualties and to save the palace from destruction. At 21 hours, 40 minutes, the cruiser Aurora fired a salvo of blanks. There were more than 10,000 men in the palace square. By 1 in the morning, there were less than 500 guards left in the palace. Antonov, Ovseyenko, and Chudnovsky led the Red Guards, soldiers and sailors in the final assault. The cadets in the palace were helpless to offer resistance to the powerful onslaught of the armed revolutionary forces. At 10 minutes after 2 in the morning, the revolutionary soldiers broke into the White Dining Room. The Winter Palace was taken in the night from the 25th to the 26th of October. I am confident that there will come a time when Smolny will be considered the temple of our spirit, and our future generations will enter it with a feeling of veneration, wrote Lunacharsky, the first People's Commissar of Education in Soviet Russia. That was the headquarters of the revolution. In the first days of the October Revolution, the auditorium was the venue of the second All-Russia Congress of Soviets, which adopted the first decrees of Soviet power. The Decree on Peace branded the imperialist war as the greatest crime against mankind. The Decree on Land abolished private ownership of land. The land was proclaimed public property. The Congress formed the Workers' and Peasants' Government, the Council of People's Commissars. Its chairman became Vladimir Ulyanov Lenin. Room number 67 in Smolny, Lenin's study. In the connecting room stands the desk of the managing administrator of the Soviet People's Commissars, Bonch Burievich. And this is the desk of Secretary Gorbunov. Military maps immediately appeared in Lenin's study. Right from the very first days, the young republic had to defend itself. Kerensky, who had fled from the capital, collected part of the troops of General Krasnov's cavalry and sent them to Petrograd. They managed to take over Gatchina, a suburb of Petrograd. The Bolsheviks called on the Petrograd workers and soldiers of the garrison not to waste a single hour, a single moment, to organize themselves and to crush the insurgents. On October 30th, the revolutionary units crushed Krasnov's forces. The anti-Soviet insurgency was defeated. Kerensky's venture was liquidated. The revolution triumphed. The power is in the hands of the workers. Workers' control was introduced at all the industrial, commercial, banking, and agricultural enterprises. Now the land belongs to the peasants. On behalf of the Soviet of People's Commissars, Lenin addressed the soldiers and sailors over the radio, calling on them to elect their authorized representatives and to begin negotiations with the enemy to end the war. Having triumphed in Petrograd, Soviet power began its victorious march throughout the country. From their own experience, the workers of Russia became convinced in the correctness of the policy of Lenin's party of Bolsheviks. The socialist revolution in Russia opened up a new era in the history of mankind. And although the years of the foreign intervention and the Civil War still lay ahead, Lenin, defining the international significance of the October Revolution, was able to declare, "The ice has been broken, the road is open, The way has been shown.